Thanks for attending this panel. It's half an hour. We're going to cover mining centralization pressures. And I'll introduce myself first. I'm Steve Lee. I lead the Spiral team at Block. Our team focuses on open source software development in Bitcoin, including mining software, such as the Stratum V2 protocol development. Rachel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Rachel. I'm formerly from Galaxy Mining, and now I lead research and development at Hut 8, and I'm a Stratum reference implementation core developer.
Hi, my name is Matt. I've worked on many things open source in Bitcoin over the last decade and almost a half now. But I guess I'm on this panel because I helped to create the Stratum V2 spec and not the implementation. People like this have actually been doing the hard work. I just spent a week in Prague a few years ago.
My name is Portland Hoddle. I'll be subbing in for Fred Thiel today. And I'm a Bitcoin Core contributor. And I basically do template generation and pool infrastructure at Marathon Digital Holdings.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Well, let's get started. Matt, maybe we'll start with you. If you could just give us a picture of what are some of the biggest centralization pressures that we face today in mining?
Yeah, so obviously, mining centralization is a really important part of Bitcoin's overall trustlessness story, right? That there are many people who could mine your transaction. You're not stuck just having one miner who could censor you and prevent you from transacting. It's a really key part of Bitcoin's overall design. And it's something that we haven't really achieved over the last decade and a half and have largely fallen flat on. Today, hash rate has gotten very decentralized, which is really great. I mean, it wasn't all the way back in the start. Satoshi was the only miner. But these days, there's ASICs all over the world, all kinds of companies in many different countries. And so the story there has actually been very positive. But on the flip side, we still have a few angles of very strong centralization, both on the ASIC front, manufacturing. There's only really, 2, soon to be 3 manufacturers, maybe 4, that make competitive hardware. And much more importantly, there's only a handful of pools, right? And so the people actually selecting the transactions that go on the block, picking the block template, building the blocks, are really the pools. And there's only, 2 of them to get to 50%, 3 or 4 to get to 75%. I mean, it's not great. So that's the real strong centralization result. But then there's, of course, things that go into that.
I think it's even worse.
It is.
Might be.
Yeah, 2 pools to get to 51% plus right now.
Yeah, so maybe for those that aren't super in the weeds on the data, maybe Portland Hoddle, can you speak to what's the distribution roughly for pools, and then how does that relate to miners themselves?
So currently the distribution for pools, you have 4 primary large pools. You have Foundry, you have via BTC, Bitmain, Antpool, and F2 pool. Those constitute over 75% currently. Marathon takes another 4 to 5%, and then you have at the pie chart, if you visualize it, you have basically the last section between 10 to 12 other pools.
Great. I think everyone in Bitcoin knows that it's decentralized, and that's an important property of Bitcoin. But what does it mean if 1 or 2 pools, are 80% of the transaction selection on Bitcoin? What could go wrong with that?
Yeah. So the thing that can go specifically wrong with having basically a very centralized set of pools, in this case 2 pools, is that those pools could collude to essentially censor a transaction. And by that, I mean they could just omit the transaction, potentially, and let the other miners pick that up, that small set of hash rate that still exists. And you could get your transaction through. It might be a little bit delayed. The worst option, though, would be potentially a government comes in and says, hey, you 2 pools, you have to orphan a block, or aka if somebody mines these transactions that we don't like in these other blocks that come from the other portions that are still decentralized, you don't build on top of that block. You keep building on top of your set of blocks, and thus a transaction could never get through at that point until that hash rate that is centralized falls below 51%, and those transactions then couldn't be reorged out of the chain. So with that said, that is the ultimate threat to Bitcoin, in my own opinion, is miner centralization, because with that, you can't have a decentralized network that is trustless. You have a permission network at that point.
Rachel, so is there any hope here? So we've talked about just a couple pools do the vast majority of the transaction selection. Why don't miners do transaction selection? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so currently miners and pools communicate over the Stratum V1 protocol, and that's a very old protocol, over 10 years old. And that basically allows the situation we're in to happen. And in this protocol, the pools are the entities that run the Bitcoin node. And we only have a handful of pools, so we only have transactions being selected from a handful of Bitcoin nodes. And the next generation of the Stratum protocol is called Stratum V2, and it essentially democratizes the block template by allowing miners to run their own Bitcoin node, select their own transactions from their own Bitcoin node with their own mempool configuration, and then mine to the pool as they normally would.
And so why isn't this the way it already works?
Well, currently, Stratum V1 is very integrated into the industry. The entire industry has been built around it. Getting the industry to move is very difficult. Asking a miner to change their tech stack is very difficult because miners are just really focused on keeping their machines online and mining Bitcoin and producing revenue. And pools also don't want to change their tech stack because they don't want to have any outages and lose clients. So in order to get Stratum V2 across the line, first, we need a production-ready Stratum V2, so we need more developers to contribute to the project. We need more pools and miners to take interest and donate miners so we can fix bugs and make it production-ready. And then we need both pools and miners to step up and put resources into adopting this protocol for the better of the network, even if it doesn't directly affect their bottom line in the short term.
Okay. Portland Huddle, I'm curious, you also work for a mining company. Do you have any perspective on, is Stratum V2 good? And if so, what's the roadmap look like, do you think, for Marathon, but maybe other miners in the space as well?
Yeah, so overall, Stratum V2 as a protocol is excellent. The ability for example, a site, right now, they have no ability to choose the transactions that go into their block. If they subscribe to Foundry as their pool or Ant pool, they literally are just bound to whatever transactions they decide in their templates that go into the blocks they build. Stratum V2 will allow them literally to just, hey, we're going to run a Bitcoin node on our site, and we will pick the block that we're going to build and submit it to that pool. That is excellent, because you can start having a bunch of different sites and decentralizing that block template construction, which allows for censorship resistance. It decentralizes Bitcoin mining. With that said, Marathon Marathon, as a pool, it's a centralized pool. It is a single Bitcoin node, in essence, that mines with their hash rate that they control completely vertically. There aren't pool members that can leave. And with that said, Stratum V2 works excellent for some of the other properties, like the connection encryption mechanism. So shares going back between the mining equipment and the pool itself, that is awesome. But Marathon doesn't necessarily need the decentralization techniques of the template generation, because we would basically generate the same template across that 5% hash rate regardless. We are currently looking into creating a potential, I can't say, but yeah, it's just like looking into potentially integrating Stratum V2 in more of a public fashion for people to potentially use as well. And so ultimately, one thing Marathon does that we would like to keep in our toolkit, and Stratum V2 does allow this, is, for example, slipstream. Marathon does select transactions that are non-standard to be a part of that kit to earn extra revenue on these blocks. The fee revenue has been pretty substantial, earning up to 5% more than miners during a 3-month time period.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about another potential source of centralization, and that's around private transaction selection, or private mempools. So earlier this year, Marathon introduced a new service called Slipstream. Maybe let's start by if you can just describe what the service is.
Yeah, so what Slipstream is, it's a way for people to get non-standard transactions in Bitcoin mined. And what I mean by that is currently in Bitcoin, if you have a transaction that maybe is bigger than what the rest of the network allows, Marathon, for an extra fee, will allow you to directly submit that transaction to them, avoiding having to go through all the kind of like barriers of the nodes along the network. And to do that, we charge a little bit of an extra fee. Think of it basically like instead of going through USPS with an item, and you go through all the shipping hubs and you got to have it checked in, you just give it right to Marathon. That's what Slipstream is.
So that sounds like a perfectly reasonable business. Matt, maybe you can. Where could it go awry? Like where could it go wrong?
Yeah. So this one, I mentioned there's several reasons why pools have been very centralized, and this is potentially one of them. It's I think you mentioned you've made 3 or a few percent additional revenue from doing this. It's not a huge number, but if that number were to become huge, this might become problematic. So what happens is if you have these private networks that miners have to operate in order to maximize their revenue, in order to actually have the most competitive mining returns, you have to have one of these networks, you have to get clients, you have to get people submitting transactions to you. This is all of a sudden a substantial new cost center to being a miner. And if you're a small miner, if you're trying to solo mine, if you're trying to use something like Stratum V2, or you're creating your own block template, and you have this very large cost center on the side, you can't effectively compete as a small miner. You know, one of the reasons we've seen hash rate be so diversely distributed across the entire globe is that the availability of cheap power doesn't always beget large farms. There are some very large farms, but there are also many small farms using otherwise unused energy and otherwise able to get very, very cheap energy. But these small farms would simply not be able to compete if they also have to have this cost center of several engineers to build out this technology stack, potentially salespeople or at least marketing to get people to use it. And so these private transaction relay networks are concerning, not in that they exist, but in if they were to become large and were to become a core part of the revenue stream of any miner, this could become a very strong centralizing force.
Go ahead.
I was going to say there's also a secondary issue that has been brought up as well, is the private mempool. So if a mining pool takes in these non-standard transactions and they're not allowed to be relayed around the network, that mempool will have a different fee rate to enter than other pools on the network. As Mara, there isn't a big effect on that. So if somebody does submit a very large transaction that takes up a whole block, it might be slightly annoying to somebody on the network, but we still did profit more off of that block, and it's such a small rate of a small portion of the hash rate. With that said, if Foundry did that, Antpool did that, these larger pools, you might need to go to like an API, for example, to figure out like what is the fee rate in mempool A, mempool B, mempool C, just to estimate fees, and they don't have to be honest about that with their users. So that is another problem potentially with these non-standard transactions and more of a centralizing force on mining.
And actually, did we could maybe, I mean, why even have the standard and non-standard transactions? Like, why does Slipstream even need to exist? Can someone maybe speak to the like Bitcoin Core relay policy and the challenges there?
Yeah. So the reason why the standardness policy exists is, and by the way, the standardness policy is what the regular node that you install. If you install Bitcoin Core on your computer, it's what transaction it allows to flow through. The standardness policy exists to make sure that a transaction that flows across the network doesn't cause your node to stall or stop processing blocks or transactions into your mempool. The reason why it doesn't matter to Marathon specifically is because of the fact that Marathon has servers running it, like Xeon's very powerful computing hardware. We can take in a lot of transactions, these very complex transactions, these very large ones, without nearly any impact. But a Raspberry Pi that had this broadcast across the network might have some trouble with that. And as a note, when Slipstream does take in a transaction, we aren't doing this to the rest of the network. It's only when the block gets mined that transaction is validated in that node, and that process is always going to be short enough to handle for a Raspberry Pi or even the weakest computer hardware on the network.
Okay, let's talk about yet another centralization pressure. I think some people have known for years it's a problem, but it really came to the forefront earlier this year, and that's FPPS payout method for pools. And maybe to provide some context for that, would someone like to just describe really just why do pools exist, handling variance, and maybe highlight 2 or 3 of the most popular payout methods?
I guess I could take that. So early in Bitcoin's history, a pool, if you join a pool, right, the whole point of a pool is that if you solo mine and you don't have a lot of hash rate, you're not going to mine blocks very often. You're going to mine block once every 6 months, once every 3 months, once a year. There's going to be a lot of variance. You might, on average, mine a block once every month, but sometimes you're going to go 3 months in a row and you're not going to mine any blocks. And as a business, if you have electricity costs, you have people costs, you can't afford that. You can't have that kind of variation in revenue, or you're just going to go out of business. You're not going to be able to pay your power bill this month just because you got a little unlucky. So pools are a fairly simple system designed primarily and maybe solely, or the goal was solely, to solve this problem directly, right? You get a bunch of miners together, they all mine a bunch of blocks together, and then they split the rewards, and then you get a fairly consistent payout, or a more consistent payout. Early on, you did this the naive way. You just got a bunch of miners together, and every time the pool mined a block, you paid out every miner proportional to how much hash rate they had put in to mining that block. Over the course of the pool mining that block, whoever, if you mine 10% of the total shares, during that time period, you get 10% of the reward. Now, that was actually trivially vulnerable to an issue called pool hopping. So more modern pools use something called paper last n shares, but functions fairly similarly. The distinction's not super relevant. This obviously still exposes miners to some level of variability, right? So the pool might be a little unlucky, the pool might be a little more lucky. Either way, the miners aren't going to get super consistent payouts. It's still going to vary a little bit, just not as much, and hopefully enough that they're going to be able to make their electricity bill at the end of the month. This variability is still not ideal, and because there's, if you are mini miners at the time were maybe not super up on what Bitcoin was, didn't have a deep technical understanding. Certainly there are many miners still today that don't. This variability is somewhat opaque. It feels like you're kind of getting screwed by your pool. Like, why are you paying me less this month than you did last month? Why are you paying me more now? I don't really get it. And so it's less predictable. It's harder to model your business on. There's many reasons why you don't really want any variability. And so pools instead started offering this fixed paper share, or I guess it's full paper share. Full paper share is what it stands for. Whatever. Where they really just pay you the same amount all the time. If you're hashing at 1 petahash, you get paid proportional 1 petahash worth of money. The expected value of each share is you're constantly getting paid the same. This is really great for miners. You finally get this completely fixed payout. But for pools, this is a substantial risk, right? The pool might be unlucky one week, might be more lucky the next week. They're going to make more or less, but they still have to pay out the same. This means that a pool, to offer a full paper share, you have to have a fairly large war chest. You have to have a lot of money sitting in your pocket, not doing anything, so that you can absorb this luck variation. And then you also have to be competitive on fees still. So today, fees have been driven down and down and down, and fees are now very low. So not only do you have to have this fairly large pot of cash sitting in the side, earning whatever bare minimum interest, but you also have to not be making very much money. So you're exposed to a very large amount of luck variation and have to have a bunch of cash without making a lot of money. So it has put a lot of pressure on pools. It's become harder and harder and harder to run a pool without having a side business that has a lot of revenue and can absorb a lot of this luck. And so it's just reduced competition in pools substantially.
Well, I think you mentioned PPLNS in that description, and I believe that's now like less than 1% of hash rate. It's pretty much been all squeezed out. FPPS is on the order of 85% of hash rate. And so FPPS, I think, represents a centralizing force. And what we learned earlier this year is that several mining pools, some of which have been around for many years, are really just now brands in front of Antpool. Antpool itself is around 50% of the hash rate that it controls. So that just to highlight the type of centralization we're seeing with this. Portland, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say that is a really important thing you're mentioning, is that basically Bitmain or Antpool are distributing their block templates, aka the transactions that go into the block, out to a couple other pools. This was discovered primarily, I think, by 0xB10C, a Bitcoin Core contributor or monitor, and he created a piece of software that literally shows all the pools in a list, and it's got colors based on like their templates they're building. If the colors match in the sequence, they have the exact same templates. And there's Poolin, Binance, and I think about 5 other pools, brains that seem to at least be matching those templates very consistently. So along with Antpool just having their hash rate, you can also kind of, by proxy, include all those pools as well as part of that same group.
Clearly running on the same Bitcoin full node that's generating the block templates.
Yeah, and I mean, to get back to the points made earlier, why is that bad? Well, censorship is a big risk. But also, I mean, we didn't talk about consensus change rules, but that there's also risk with that too. We probably don't have enough time to get into that topic, but it's another risk. So, is there any hope with this FPPS centralization risk? And one thing I'd point out, just the audience knows, as time moves forward, we're going to see the fee component of miner revenue increase over time versus the subsidy you get in each block. And that increases the variability of how much a miner gets paid per block, which increases the variability in FPPS and just further adds risk to the mining pool running FPPS. So with that context, what's the future look like for FPPS or maybe other payout methods?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't think any of us has the answer for it. You know, we have to see how the fee market develops in Bitcoin and see how big that variation is, especially daily and weekly and seasonal variations in fee. You know, if today we do see a little bit, but it might change, might be more, might be less, of during the day in the Western world, you see a little more demand for block space, you see a little bit higher fees, and then at night during the day in Asia, you see a little bit less, but that might shift. We never know where that's going to go. But this does mean, you know, if you're mining more at night in the United States or something, because maybe the power is cheaper, your pool is going to make less money, but they're still going to be paying you out the same. So the FPPS payout structure might have to change a little bit. You know, we might see more variation in the payouts that miners are receiving. And we'll see. But of course, you know, as we mentioned, there's really strong pressure on the pools to keep a very, very, very consistent payout as much as possible for their miners, because this is really what miners are paying them for. So how that pressure develops, you know, whether it means that pools need even bigger pockets, even deeper pockets, so there's going to be even more centralization in pools, or whether that means that there's just going to be more variation on miners and they're going to have to learn to deal with it, you know, depends a lot on where that market goes. But there's going to be a lot more pressure on this. This is only going to get stronger and stronger, more centralization pressure and more pressure on pools to have really deep pockets.
Yeah, so I don't think we really have an answer to that. So that's something, you know, everyone in the audience should be aware of, and I think it's going to play out over time. We'll see how it goes. We've got a few minutes left. Let's talk about one more centralization pressure, and that's the ASIC chips themselves that run that do the mining. There's only a couple manufacturers that dominate the market share right now. Maybe Rachel, can you speak to what it looks like right now in terms of, you know, who are those vendors and why is that a concern and risk, and maybe what the future might hold?
Yeah, so right now there's definitely a monopoly on ASICs, mainly being from Bitmain. All this firmware ships with SV1, and with Bitmain machines, they give you a reduction in dev fee if you mine to Antpool, so you're heavily incentivized to mine to Antpool, which is the pool that is the proxy for all major FPPS pools. So that's heightening centralization issues. So we really need to see more ASIC manufacturers come online that have good software and create competition in the market for alternatives. And it would also be great to see firmware shipped with SV2. If firmware is shipped with SV2, it's easier on the miners because they don't have to run a piece of translation software to convert from their SV1 to an SV2 pool. So it's really important that more ASIC manufacturers come out with better firmware that does not lock you into a specific pool, especially the most centralized pool.
Yeah, and perhaps new competition will lead to more innovation, and maybe we'll see some of that SV2 firmware created.
Hopefully.
There's a couple minutes left. I'm curious, does anyone in the audience have a question? Would love to, yeah. Do we have a microphone? Yeah.
Is that Marty? All right.
Uh-oh, Marty has a question for us.
All right. Try to keep it short and sweet. I think a lot of the discussion around the payout centralization risk, which I'm going to be talking about on the stage in an hour, so this is good prep, is focused on the technical side. And you guys mentioned capital side. We have the central bank of Mempool. I have a two-part question. Could a capital market fix this, where instead of having to go to Mempool, you have a credit provider that pools are able to go to dig into a treasury, so they're not forced to go to Mempool? And then two, have we been thinking about mining pool businesses wrong this whole time? Because if you look at the two largest, in Mempool and Foundry, they really have an underlying business that's secure with Bitmain hardware, and then Foundry is a DCG company of exchanges, many other things. So when we're building these pools, that's why I'm excited to see Block come out with ASICs. Is that what we need first? A secure revenue stream selling something like ASICs, and then you build a pool on top?
Yeah, I mean, on the first question, you ask about capital markets providing this pool insurance that really allows pools to do PPS. I think ideally, yes, right? Ideally, this is disaggregated from the pool. Why are you using, the pool is doing reward splitting, that's great, but do you really need your insurance that keeps your business having a reliable revenue stream to come from the same entity doing that? Potentially no, but the problem with the disaggregation there is that it adds cost, right? That you have this other party that's now charging a fee for their service, presumably. And today, like Rachel mentioned, you with Mempool especially, because you're buying their hardware, you have a business relationship with them, you can negotiate a very competitive rate on your hardware, but also your pool together. And so disaggregating that might potentially just add too much cost for miners, and we might not really be able to sustain that. Or at least that would be my concern there. What was the second question? There was a second part to that question. Oh, do you need an ASIC business to run a pool? Potentially, yeah. I mean, I think you phrased it as have we been thinking about pools all wrong? The answer is yes. We should be going back to P2 pool and braid pool in the future, right? We shouldn't have these centralized pools. But do you need a separate business to run a pool? And I think probably yes. I mean, I think we talk about the demand for FPPS with increasing variance on the side of the pools as fees continue to grow as a proportion of block reward. It's just going to get harder and harder for you to have just a pool as a business that isn't have a very large revenue stream on the side and become more horizontally integrated with some other part of the mining stack.
Thank you for the question. We're out of time. Thank you so much, panelists.
Next year, we are bringing the Bitcoin conference to the American West, Las Vegas. The brightest minds in the world will converge to deliver Bitcoin history. Buy your tickets now at b.tc/conference/2025.